Cookie auth is everywhere on the web. Most of the sites that you visit on a day-to-day basis are using cookies to authenticate you. Here's an overview of how cookie auth typically works. The first step is for the user to provide their credentials. This is normally done by filling out a form on a web page. The credentials are then posted to a server. On the server, we try to find a matching user from some data store and we check the password validity. If the validation fails, it's normal to redirect the user back to the login page and indicate that their credentials were invalid. If the validation succeeds, then we usually set a cookie on the user's browser by sending a set cookie header in the response. The cookie is then sent by the browser in any future request. This allows the server to quickly identify you without having to go through the whole username password thing every time. Let's start off from the same place as in video 4. We have our simple blog with a restricted page that's currently open to the world. We're going to restrict the page to users that have logged in via the login form and have a valid cookie in their browser. The first thing I want to do is create a place to hold the login form. I'm going to go ahead and create two routes. The first route will render our login page when we visit /login. The second route, which uses the post method, is the route that will receive the username and password posted from the login form. This is where I'll write the logic to verify the user's credentials, but for now I'm just going to leave the two routes identical. I'll create a new template for the login page and paste some HTML for the form. We can browse to this by loading /login in the browser. This form doesn't do anything useful yet because we need to integrate it with hapi.js. Let's go ahead and install and require hapi.js. We'll also need to register it with our server. Now, just like with basic auth, we need to make a strategy by calling server.auth.strategy. We'll pass the name of the strategy, which I'll call restricted, the name of the scheme that we're basing this off, which is the cookie scheme, and an options object containing a password, which we'll be using for encrypting the cookie data before it's sent to the browser. The name of the cookie, we'll go with session, and a value for is secure. For any production app, you're going to want this to be true, but we'll use false here because I've not covered TLS yet in this course. Let's then set this auth strategy on the restricted route. If we browse to that route, we get this ugly JSON error. This isn't really the behavior that we want to see. What we'd like is that if someone tries to access a restricted page without a valid cookie, they get redirected to the login page. We can achieve this by setting the redirect to option on the strategy. So let's refresh, and there, perfect. Now let's work on the post handler for the login form. First, we'll pull the username and password from the request payload. We'll try to find a user with that username. If the user doesn't exist, or if the provided password doesn't match the stored password, we'll render the login form again. If everything looks good though, we can set a cookie, essentially logging the user in. We set a cookie by calling request.cookieauth.set and we pass an object. We'll just include one property, the user's username. Finally, we'll redirect the user to the restricted page. Let's give this a whirl. Bingo! Let's open up the Chrome DevTools, browse to the Application tab, and we can see the cookie here in the browser. The contents of the cookie might look like nonsense, but this is an encrypted string that contains the object that we passed to cookieauth.set before. Now it's time to make some improvements. Currently we don't have any way to log the user out. To fix this, I'm going to make a new route at /logout. In the handler, we'll call request.cookieauth.clear, which will cause the browser to delete the stored cookie. We'll also redirect the user back to the home page. Let's test this out. From the restricted page, let's browse to /logout. We're redirected to the home page. We can also see that the session cookie has gone. It's a little bit inconvenient to manually type /logout into the browser. It would be useful if we had a link in the nav for logout and login. So let's add a couple of extra links into the nav. It doesn't make a lot of sense to show both of these links at the same time. We should show the login link only if the user is not logged in, and vice versa. To get to this point though, we need some extra work. Firstly, we need to tell hapi.cookie how to associate the user's cookie with some authentication credentials. We define an extra option called validatefunc. This is a function that's going to be executed on every request to a route covered by the strategy. The arguments are the request object and the decoded cookie object. We return an object with two properties: valid, which is whether the user's cookie matches a valid user, and credentials, which is some information about the user that we can then use in our route handlers. The logic inside here is very simple. We'll try to find the user from our user data with the username stored in the cookie. We'll return an object. Valid is whether or not the user existed, and for credentials we can use the user object itself. To be able to access this user data in our views, we need to add it to the view context. The nav that we want to update is present in all pages, so it makes sense to add it to the default view context like we've done for ads and the blog title. A problem, however, is unlike those bits of data, the logged in user isn't static data. It changes for every request depending on who is requesting the route. Luckily, we can define a function instead of a static object for the default context. It takes an argument, which is the request object, and we return the original object plus one extra property for which we can use request.auth.credentials. We can now update our layout template. If the user is logged in, we'll show the restricted link and a logout link. Otherwise, we'll show a login link. As a bonus, we'll also add some text into the logout link to indicate who the logged in user is. Browsing to the restricted route, we see this is working as expected. But there's a hitch. If we go to the home page, the nav has been reset to the logged out stage even though we didn't actually log out. So this is an opportunity to introduce a crucial idea about authentication in Hapi, and it trips many developers up. So the credentials are only made available to routes that actually use authentication. This is so important, I'm going to repeat in a different way. If you have a route that you didn't explicitly set authentication on, then Hapi is not going to bother to decode that cookie, so you have no idea who's accessing that page. In this app, we only set authentication on a single route, the restricted route, so that's the only route where our nav is working properly. As you might have guessed, there is a way to resolve this. We'll set the cookie auth strategy to apply to all routes. So we'll make a call to server.auth.default, pass an object with property strategy equal to restricted. This has the effect of applying cookie auth to all routes now. If we browse to some of our pages, we'll see the nav is working great everywhere. So, are we done? Well, actually there's still a problem. Let's log out. Oh dear, this does not look good. Too many redirects. Let's take a step back and think about what's happening here. So when we logged out, we were redirected to the home page. But the home page now requires auth, so as per our redirect to option, we were redirected to the login page. However, the login page now also needs auth, so that directed us to the login page. So as you might see, we're stuck in an infinite loop of redirects. This looks bad, but there's a solution. We want only the restricted page to be locked down to logged in users. We still want non-logged in users to be able to access the rest of the site. Hapi authentication can operate in three modes. There's the required mode, which is the default. So this means if a user can't be authenticated, then they're not allowed to access the route. And there's also a try mode. This means that Hapi is going to try to authenticate the user, but if it fails, they're still going to be allowed to access the route. Try mode is what we want in this instance. Let's update the call to server.auth.default and add a mode property and set it to try. We'll also set another option on the strategy, redirect on try, to false. This tells Hapi not to redirect us on a route with try mode. We'll override the mode specifically for the restricted route and set it to required. Remember, we don't want anyone to be able to access that page unless they're really logged in. Finally, everything is working as we want. The nav is correct on all pages and no more nasty redirect loops. Now there's just one finishing touch. When we submit the login form with invalid credentials, we get directed back to the form, but it doesn't indicate that anything went wrong. We can fix this easily by adding an error property to the context when we render the form a bad input. We can then use that to conditionally render the login form with some additional error styling. I hope you enjoyed this video. Please remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also use the form linked in the video description to request more videos.